Chapter 3. The Seduction of Readiness. Readiness is one of the mind's most elegant delays because it rarely looks like delay from the inside. It arrives dressed as care. It sounds like discernment. It speaks with the tone of someone refusing to waste time or force a result that is not yet ripe. It presents itself as maturity, even restraint, when what it often protects is not quality but comfort. The mind learns early that action exposes. It exposes competence, judgment, taste, limits. It reveals what has and has not been built. Thought can be private and endless. Preparation can be impressive and untestable. Action is public, even when no one is watching, because it produces something that can be measured against reality. Once a person has felt the sting of that measurement, once effort has collided with resistance in a way that felt personal, the mind begins to look for ways to approach work without encountering the full force of contact. Readiness offers that approach. It creates a threshold that feels rational. A person does not avoid the work, they simply wait until the moment is right. They do not refuse to begin, they postpone beginning in the name of alignment. The mind, in this arrangement, remains busy and therefore feels innocent. It thinks, adjusts, calibrates, checks the temperature of its interior. It becomes preoccupied with the question of whether engagement would be wise, whether today's mood is compatible with the work, whether energy is sufficient, whether clarity has arrived. The task stands nearby, patient and unchanged, while the inner world becomes the main arena. The seduction is not merely that readiness delays, it is that it gives the delay a sense of integrity. It makes postponement feel principled. A person can spend hours circling a task while maintaining the impression that they are treating it with respect. Readiness frames itself as a guardrail against sloppy effort, a refusal to operate in a compromised state. In industries where quality matters, where mistakes are expensive and reputation is fragile, this can sound like professionalism. The problem is that the mind quickly expands what counts as compromised until ordinary human variation, fatigue, ambiguity, mild anxiety, the flatness of routine, begins to qualify as disqualifying. At that point, readiness stops being a sensible concern and becomes a gatekeeper. It stands between the worker and the work, demanding a feeling that is rarely stable enough to be negotiated with. If readiness is defined as the absence of resistance, it becomes unattainable. If it is defined as confidence, it becomes circular. Confidence is often produced by movement, not granted as permission for it. If it is defined as clarity, it becomes evasive, because clarity is frequently the product of contact with the thing that is being avoided. This is why readiness is so often paired with a particular kind of inner monitoring. The mind starts to check itself before it checks the work. It scans for willingness, for excitement, for a sense of inevitability. It expects a certain smoothness at the start, as though engagement should arrive with no friction. When that smoothness is absent, the absence is interpreted as information rather than weather. The mind treats the first sensation of reluctance as a message about the work's appropriateness, the work's timing, or the worker's capacity, and it begins to act as though interpretation is responsibility. The lived experience of this can be unremarkable. A person opens a laptop, glances at an inbox, and feels a small tightening in the chest. Nothing dramatic follows, no clear panic, no conscious fear. Still, the tightening is registered. The mind does not say, "there is tension," it says, "this will be a lot." The day subtly shifts. The worker begins to move sideways toward tasks that feel safer, toward organizing, toward minor adjustments that can be completed without risking the discomfort of contact. The hours remain active, messages get answered, files get renamed, a calendar gets cleaned. The sensation of being occupied is preserved, but the task that matters most remains untouched, waiting behind the ritual of readiness. What makes this so persuasive is that the rituals can resemble real preparation. There are forms of setup that legitimately reduce friction. A clean workspace can help. A plan can prevent wasted motion. But readiness is different from preparation because it is not aimed at the task's reality. It is aimed at the worker's feeling state. It is an attempt to engineer an internal condition in which action will feel more comfortable. The work becomes a kind of test of emotional legitimacy. Engagement is allowed only when the mind approves the atmosphere in which it will occur. This approval process is rarely conscious. It is experienced as taste, intuition, self-knowledge. A person can describe it as knowing when they are on, as having learned not to push when conditions are wrong. There is a small truth inside this claim. There are states in which pushing is genuinely unwise. There are days when exhaustion makes precision impossible and when continued effort degrades judgment. But the mind's interest in readiness does not stay confined to these extremes. It drifts into ordinary days, into ordinary sensations, until the worker becomes dependent on a narrow range of internal climates to access their own competence. That dependence changes the structure of work. Work stops being something done from within life and becomes something done only under special lighting. It requires the correct mood, the correct music, the correct hour, the correct stretch of uninterrupted time, the correct sense of mental openness. The mind begins to treat these conditions not as helpful, but as necessary. The worker becomes a curator of circumstances instead of an operator within whatever circumstances arrive. A strange irony follows. The more a person waits for readiness, the less ready they become. The capacity to begin without emotional permission weakens through disuse. Starting begins to feel heavier precisely because it has been framed as a moment that requires justification. When readiness is made a prerequisite, the first start starts to carry symbolic weight. It becomes a referendum on the self. If engagement begins and feels difficult, the mind reads that difficulty as proof that readiness was absent. It concludes that the wait should have continued. This conclusion reinforces the threshold, making the next start even more conditioned on the promise of ease. The mind likes this arrangement because it reduces risk. Readiness creates a plausible reason to avoid exposure. If a person does not begin, they cannot fail. If they do begin and it feels wrong, they can interpret the wrongness as a signal rather than the ordinary friction of entering effort. The mind remains protected, not necessarily from failure itself, but from the blunt honesty of seeing where effort actually stands. This is why readiness is so often paired with moral language. It becomes associated with authenticity, with self-respect, with refusing to betray one's own rhythm. In a culture that often confuses force with discipline, it is easy to imagine that refusing to push is a form of wisdom. But readiness does not always refuse force. More often, it refuses contact. It refuses the mild discomfort of beginning with uncertainty, the imperfect feeling of moving forward without emotional endorsement. The mind, when it is governed by readiness, begins to treat discomfort as a sign of misalignment rather than as a feature of living. This is an expensive mistake. Discomfort is not a reliable compass. It often appears whenever growth is occurring, whenever something meaningful is at stake, whenever attention is required in a way that cannot be faked. The work that changes a person tends to involve the kind of friction that readiness as a gatekeeper would interpret as a warning. There is a particular form of sophistication in the readiness story because it can attach itself to excellence. It can claim that it is protecting standards. A writer tells themselves they don't want to write poorly. A manager tells themselves they don't want to lead from irritability. A builder tells themselves they don't want to rush decisions and create rework. These are real concerns, yet the mind's solution is often not improved process, but delayed engagement, as though the route to quality is waiting until the body feels different. Quality, however, is rarely produced by a pristine inner state. It is produced by attention applied repeatedly, by contact refined over time, by mistakes corrected, by the gradual tightening of craft. The mind prefers the fantasy that the right mood will deliver the right outcome, because this fantasy preserves the idea that excellence is a matter of alignment rather than labor. If excellence is alignment, then waiting can be mistaken for working towards it. In reality, waiting tends to accumulate fog. The longer a task remains unentered, the more it becomes an object of imagination. Imagination expands it. It adds consequence. It adds stakes. The mind begins to rehearse what could go wrong, and this rehearsal feels like responsibility, but it often functions as intimidation. The task becomes larger than it was when it was still simply a task. Readiness then becomes even more appealing because the mind insists it cannot approach something this large without feeling prepared. This is one of the quiet ways readiness manufactures its necessity. It delays contact until the task feels like a threshold, then claims that the threshold requires a special state to cross. The worker stands at the entrance of their own inflated story. waiting for a feeling that can neutralize a fear the mind itself created. The emotional dependence here is subtle because it does not always look like seeking pleasure. Often it is the avoidance of a particular flavor of discomfort. There are people who will work endlessly when urgency is high, who can sprint in crisis, who can operate with ferocious clarity when the stakes are immediate. Their dependence is not on feeling good, but on feeling forced. In calmer periods, when nothing is on fire, readiness becomes the excuse for drift. Without the adrenaline of necessity, the mind claims it cannot access its best self. It waits for pressure to provide the focus it has not learned to generate through orientation alone. This is another form of readiness, one that hides behind intensity. The worker is convinced they are productive because they can produce in bursts, but the bursts are often triggered by fear or deadline rather than by deliberate engagement. The mind becomes conditioned to require emotional fuel. Calm becomes suspicious, quiet becomes inertia. The worker begins to believe that their real capability only appears under strain, which means they begin to rely on strain as a condition of performance. The long-term cost of this dependence is not only irregular output, but a distorted relationship with time. Time stops being a medium for steady building and becomes a stage for emotional episodes. Work happens in peaks and valleys, guided by anxiety, urgency, excitement, or dread. The in-between, the ordinary hours in which most of life actually occurs, begins to feel unusable. Readiness turns those hours into a waiting room. In a working life, the waiting room is where careers flatten, not through collapse, but through lack of accumulation. Skill compounds through consistent contact. Reputation compounds through consistent delivery. Wealth compounds through consistent decisions made without emotional theater. When readiness governs, consistency becomes accidental. Accumulation becomes a matter of whether the mind happens to feel cooperative. What is lost here is not intelligence or ambition, it is access. The worker still knows what matters, they still have standards. They may even have a sharp vision of who they want to become, but readiness keeps that person slightly out of reach. The worker becomes someone who can do exceptional work under the right conditions at the right time with the right feeling. They become intermittently powerful. They become dependent on weather. The deeper seduction is that readiness offers a story about identity that feels flattering. It suggests a person is sensitive to nuance, that they are principled, that they will not produce mediocre output. It implies an artist's integrity or a leader's emotional intelligence. The mind enjoys this interpretation because it transforms hesitation into virtue. It makes delay feel like a sign of depth rather than a refusal of the ordinary discomfort required to build anything real. Underneath this, the present moment remains stubbornly indifferent. The present does not care whether a person feels aligned. It does not adjust its requirements to match mood. Deadlines still approach. People still need answers. Bodies still age. Opportunities still shift. The world moves forward without waiting for internal consensus. This does not mean the worker should become cruel to themselves or pretend that emotion is irrelevant. It means the worker must understand what emotion can and cannot do. Emotion can inform, it can warn, it can reveal, but it is not built to govern timing. It is too variable to hold that responsibility without producing instability. When emotion becomes the gatekeeper, the worker's relationship to their own life becomes contingent, as though the basic act of showing up requires a certain internal climate to be legitimate. A more honest view is that readiness is often nothing more than the mind asking to be spared the feeling of beginning. Beginning is awkward. It is the moment when the task has not yet yielded momentum. It is the moment when effort has not yet produced evidence. It is the moment when skill feels least accessible because it has not yet warmed into motion. The mind dislikes this phase because it offers no immediate reward. It offers only contact. Contact is the one thing readiness tries to postpone, because contact is where the mind can no longer maintain its preferred stories. Once contact occurs, the work answers back. It provides feedback. It reveals what is real. The imagined complexity either collapses into a sequence of concrete steps or reveals itself as genuine difficulty that must be endured. Either way, the mind loses the ability to hover in theoretical space. This is why readiness is so often paired with the fantasy of a future self. The mind imagines a version of the worker who will begin later, more focused, more energized, more certain, more pristine. That future self is always about to arrive. It is always one good night's sleep away, one clear morning away, 1 week of stability away. The mind uses this imagined self as justification for delay because it feels reasonable to wait for a better instrument before attempting the performance. But the instrument is the same. The worker who begins later will begin with the same mind, the same body, the same tendency for sensation and story. The idea that readiness will appear as a permanent state is a comforting myth. Inner weather can improve, but it does not become fixed. The worker who waits for fixed inner climate is waiting for a kind of inner climate that does not exist in human life. There is another way to understand what people call readiness, one that strips it of romance. Readiness is often not a state, but a transition. It is what happens when attention moves from diffusion to contact, when the mind stops scanning itself and starts meeting the work. In this sense, readiness is not something to locate before beginning, it is something that forms as beginning occurs. This is why a person can sit for an hour thinking about a task, feeling increasingly heavy, then make a single concrete move and feel the atmosphere shift. The shift is not magic, it is not motivation arriving from nowhere. It is the nervous system responding to contact. The mind, confronted with actual movement, stops inflating the unknown. It begins to adjust to reality. The task becomes present, and presence reduces the mind's appetite for story. The worker who understands this stops treating readiness as permission and begins treating it as a byproduct, not a reward, but a consequence of contact. The mind may still protest at the threshold. It may still generate narratives about timing, quality, energy. But those narratives begin to lose their authority once the worker recognizes that the threshold is not a gate to be opened by feeling, but a surface to be entered by action. This is not a dramatic transformation. It is often quiet. It does not feel like confidence. It feels like a small internal refusal to keep negotiating. It feels like attention settling on the first real demand of the task rather than onto the mind's commentary about it. It feels like a narrowing. The narrowing matters because it reorients the worker away from the inner theater. When readiness governs, attention is directed inward toward monitoring. When contact governs, attention is directed outward toward requirement. The difference is not philosophical, it is practical. A worker can spend an entire morning in a refined internal conversation about how to approach something and still have nothing to show for it. Requirement does not respond to refinement. It responds to contact. Once this becomes visible, readiness starts to look less like wisdom and more like a kind of emotional bargaining. The mind tries to bargain its way into work without paying the price of beginning. It wants the momentum without the awkwardness. It wants the confidence without the exposure. It wants the satisfaction without the initial friction. It wants a version of work that begins halfway through. But all real work begins at the beginning, which is precisely what makes it difficult to romanticize. The beginning is where incompetence is felt most sharply, where uncertainty is loudest, where the mind has the least evidence that effort will pay off. The beginning is where self would most prefer to be spared. It is also where skill actually is built, because the beginning is where contact is most honest. This is why the uncompromising fact of the present moment returns here again. There is no later moment that will do the beginning for you. There is no future version of the self who can enter effort without encountering the ordinary friction of entering. The only difference between the worker who accumulates and the worker who waits is one treats the beginning as part of the work and the other treats it as a prerequisite to the work. If readiness is allowed to remain seductive, it will always find new reasons. It will attach itself to new conditions. It will argue that the next period will be better, that the next week will be clearer, that the next morning will be quieter. It will find language that sounds intelligent and humane. It will continue to protect the worker from the small discomfort of contact while quietly exposing them to the larger discomfort of stagnation. The mind can live for a long time in this arrangement, especially if the outer life remains stable enough to tolerate drift. Many people do. They become experts in preparation. They become articulate about their intentions. They can describe what they want with precision. Their inner world becomes sophisticated. Yet sophistication without contact does not become craft. It becomes a kind of internal architecture built around the avoidance of risk. Risk, in the context of work, is not always dramatic. Often it is simply the risk of seeing what is true, the risk of discovering that a task is harder than imagined, or easier than imagined, or that one's current skill is not yet what the story said it was. Readiness delays that discovery. It keeps the self-image intact. It keeps possibility untested. It preserves the fantasy that a better performance is waiting inside a better mood. Contact removes the fantasy, and in doing so, it can feel like loss. But the loss is mostly of an illusion that was expensive to maintain. Once the illusion drops, the worker is left with something far more useful, a task that can actually be approached, a present moment that can actually be used, a life that can actually be built. The transition is rarely clean. The mind does not stop offering readiness as an option. It continues to suggest waiting, especially when something matters. It continues to interpret discomfort as information. The difference is that the worker's relationship to those suggestions changes. The mind's proposals become audible rather than authoritative. They become part of the weather rather than the terrain. And then, in the most ordinary way, the hand moves. A sentence begins. A call is made. A decision is drafted. The first contact is not heroic. It is often unimpressive. It does not announce itself as a breakthrough. It is simply the moment the worker stops waiting for the inner world to grant permission and lets the present moment receive what it has been asking for all along.